dolls. We don't see stuff like this anymore. You see some of the box stuff that come with the fancy dresses and all. The attention to detail in the painting is not there. At the time when these were dolls for children, dolls for fashion, they're all individually painted in factories. Every person had a job to do, whether it was an eyelash or an eyebrow or one part of the shape of lips, because all these dolls have been fired like 5 times to get the depth in their faces. So that's an era that's long gone. Everything now is done mechanically, or by a machine. Another thing, these are so important because a lot of these types of dolls that children weren't allowed to play with, they were bought in either France or Germany and brought home. If they were a very wealthy family, they bought the more elaborate looking dolls. The poor families, they actually had dolls with just the chemise on, like a slip. And they would bring them home to their kids, and then when the dads would go off smoking cigars in the parlor with the men, the women would go to their parlor and they'd take out their needles and thread, and they would make clothing to clothe the dolls that only had the chemises on. So, and then there's another real big deal about these dolls. In America, we didn't have these dolls back in the 1800s. Paris, who was the big fashion industry, would ship the fashion dolls are 2 of the ones at the end. The doll that's in the morning outfit, and the FG here had the latest style at the time. They would put on ships and ship them to New York, so that New York could see what the latest and the greatest fashions were. So the fashion dolls were used in that trade and that period of time. How I got into this, I always liked dolls. My mother gave all my stuff away. We never had room to keep it. So when I moved here in 1990, I found a doll shop. I walked in, I wanted to buy one for my daughter, and I heard a voice coming from the back that said, "You can make those." And I thought, really? How can you? And I've done ceramics before, but ceramics is a little bit different. It's not quite as, you're not quite as particular. You can still paint pretty things and all, but the porcelain has got such a beautiful hue to it. Well, anyway, I started with a baby, a regular looking baby, looked like a real baby. Didn't excite me too much, but I did a fairly good job on it. And my husband said, "God, that thing looks like it's gonna wake up any minute. It looks so real." So I went from there to another chunky little toddler looking doll, another modern doll. And she didn't do much for me, even though she was really pretty. And then I saw an antique doll in Ann Chapman, if anybody happens to know who she is. And I know Lucy here did dolls before at her shop. I don't know if she's still here. Anyway, I saw an antique doll and I immediately fell in love with it. And I thought, God, that looks like a real dolly. It doesn't look like a Barbie, and it doesn't look like one of those little dolls that does things now that you can buy in the store for your kids. So she said, well, I've got some molds. And so we started pouring molds, and I don't have the first one I've done here. That's back at home with the other 100 or 150 of them. So the costuming that these dolls wore back then, I think is probably what made me love them even more. Besides their big round eyes, in fact, those are glass eyes. Those are all made in Europe. Those glass eyes. The fabrics on all these dresses are all from Europe. They're all silks. And they're silk laces. There's nothing polyester. And not only that, I belong to a doll guild, and we compete. So everything's got to be done by hand unless it's a straight stitch. A straight stitch, because they had sewing machines in the 1800s, we were allowed to make a straight stitch. But everything else is done by hand. All the hand sewing inside, you have to tuck all your seams, fold them, and hand stitch them neatly, or kind of zigzag stitches by hand. The pleating is all done by hand, not by machine. Everything. What else? Gosh. I have a little tiny iron and an ironing board that's this big. You've got a little skinny place so you can slide sleeves in. Oh yeah. So there's all kinds of stuff that goes with dolls. Anyway, that you can buy. You can spend $1 million on the fabrics and all. In fact, I was telling the girls at the table, I saw this fabric at one of the conventions I went to. And it was $100 a yard, but I knew I could buy a quarter of that and use it on one of those little tiny dolls there, so I'd still have that gorgeous fabric. Anyway, there's